You have to go to the ends of the earth in order to leave Earth. At least that's what Scott Kelly learned from personal experience. Spending a year in space is really not an easy job to do. It took him sheer determination and a lot of sacrifices to endure. To be with the people he loved, to sit at a table and eat a meal with them, were the simple things he had dreamt of for almost a year in zero gravity. And if there's someone who knows what it's like to come back to gravity after having been in space, he is definitely one of the very few people. The dream to become an astronaut started when he was just a boy. He dreamt he was confined to a small space. He knew he would be there for a long time, but he didn't mind. The sense that he was doing something challenging at that moment was appealing to him. He felt like he was where he belonged. He also remembered watching men walking on the moon on television. And, just like some of the other astronauts he knew, that was the moment they decided to go to space one day. As a kid, he took all the risks because everything else seemed boring. He found it perplexing that some people could just sit still during school days, that they could resist the urge to run outside and explore. He couldn't see himself studying like the other kids, and that made him a terrible student. He was always scolded by teachers. His parents tried to discipline him and his brother, but were unsuccessful. When their parents were not around, they were free to do what they liked, and what they liked was to take risks. For Scott, attempting something difficult was the only way to live. He still managed to graduate from high school. However, in his college years, he had no idea what he wanted to do in life or what he wanted to be, until one day he found the book The Right Stuff. He was captivated by the descriptions of the Navy test pilots, aircraft carriers, generally moving through the world like exceptional badasses. Some even became astronauts, which was a real job too. It's not just an exciting adventure story, but more like a life plan. He found an ambition, and everything changed since then. It wasn't an easy journey for him, but the more he took risks, the more he became thrilled with it. He still couldn't imagine how different his life had now become. He had reached his goal, both personally and professionally. Scott wanted to be a part of something great. He thought that it would be an honor to be part of the many discoveries that will be made. After all, it's the reason why they volunteered for the year-long mission. They plan to discover the effects of long-term spaceflight on the human body. Space agencies need to learn different ways to make the human mind and body stronger before pushing out further into space. If there's one important thing that Scott learned during his whole expedition, it's that people can actually do anything the moment they set their hearts and minds to it. February 20th, 2015. Star City, Russia, is the place where cosmonauts and astronauts have been trained for the past years. From Star City, Scott Kelly flew 1,600 miles to Baikonur with his two Russian crewmates. Baikonur is a place considered as the only working human spaceport. There, they were welcomed by the mayor, some local dignitaries, officials from Roscosmos, the Russian space agency, and Energia, the company that builds the Soyuz spacecraft, which will take them into the orbit dock with the International Space Station, ISS. The International Space Station got its start in 1984 and became a remarkable achievement of technology and international cooperation. It is by far the longest inhabited structure in space and the largest peacetime international project in history. The ISS is also a world-class orbiting laboratory. Scott and his crewmate Mikhail Khomienko's, or Misha's, mission to spend a year on ISS was pioneering because scientists didn't have any information regarding the state of the human body when exposed to space after 6 months. In addition, because he has a twin brother, Mark, who was also an astronaut, their bodies were to be compared for the entire year, all the way down to their genes. The following day, they had their first fit check. It's also an opportunity for them to get inside the Soyuz capsule. The Soyuz is designed to maneuver in space, dock with the station, and keep human beings alive. But the rockets are the workhorses, humanity's answer to the pull of Earth's gravity. There was also the Progress resupply vehicle that would deliver equipment, experiments, food, oxygen, and care packages to them on the ISS. They had some kind of a dress rehearsal. They would suit up, perform leak checks, and then get strapped into their custom-made seats. They would practice using the hardware, reaching out for buttons, reading data off screens, and grabbing their checklists. Scott, Misha, and Gennady Padalka discussed their plans to trust one another with their lives while riding space. Soon they were getting ready on the day of the launch. They met with their Russian flight surgeon and carried things out according to Russian traditions. They were taken to a building where they suited up. Then they walked into another room which was divided by a sheet of glass. On the other side were their families, managers from the Russian Space Agency, NASA leaders, and members of the media sitting in rows of seats facing them. On their side of the glass was a mock-up of the Soyuz seat. Scott, Gennady, and Misha lied on their backs while their suits were being checked for leaks. Afterward, they had a last talk, through microphones, with their families. When they finished, they boarded a bus, and Scott gave a last wave to his family until they were gone. However, during the last leg of their journey, the bus stopped, and Scott's brother suddenly jumped in. Seeing his brother meant the world to him. They rode together to the launch pad. Scott and his brother were born in 1964. One early morning, when they were toddlers, they got bored, opened the back door, and left the house while their parents were sleeping. They reached a gas station and played in Greece. The owner found them and brought them back to their house. Later on, he came by and told their mother what had happened. When they were kindergarten students, their mother asked them to put a letter in a mailbox directly across the street. She gave them specific instructions on where to cross safely. However, Mark wanted a shortcut on the way back and was hit by a car while crossing in the middle of the street. As children, they continued to take crazy risks. They had a certain kind of freedom. They rode their bikes, went crabbing, and built rafts out of spare fence planks. Both of them also got hurt, and often got stitches. They got into a lot of fights during second grade, but never got arrested because they were children of a cop. Their father was an alcoholic. He used to have cookouts in a nearby park with his cop buddies, but when they became drunk cops, they got into arguments and pulled their guns out. Scott and Mark used to spend one night a week with their paternal grandparents so their parents could go out drinking. They always did the same things, and Scott loved the stability of life with his grandparents. Eventually, their parents thought they didn't need to be taken care of anymore. Their parents would come home in the middle of the night, drunk and fighting. When Scott was a teenager, he tried to intervene in the violence between his parents. In spite of his father's behavior, he still respected and idolized him in some ways. Besides, he was good-looking and charming when he was sober. When he was about 11, his mother wanted a career and decided to become a cop. She took several exams, and with the help of his father, she became one of the very few women to pass the test. That made a big impression on Scott and Mark. that a seemingly impossible goal can be achieved through sheer force of determination and support from the people around. Scott remembered himself being a bad student. He even ended up screwing his college application and didn't wind up at the school he had meant to apply to. In his freshman year, he started out with great hope that he could turn things around to be a good student, but he realized that it was impossible for him to focus in class or to study on his own. One day, everything changed when he picked up the book, The Right Stuff. He felt like he had found his calling. He wanted to be like the guys in the book. He wanted to be a naval aviator. It had given him the outline of a life plan. At the launch site, Scott, Gennady, and Misha climbed the first few stairs heading toward the elevator. Then they turned to say goodbye to the crowd, waving to the people of Earth one last time. While inside the Soyuz, the activation of the launch escape system alerted them with a loud sound. The escape system is a separate rocket connected to the top of the spacecraft. It was designed to pull the capsule free in case of an explosion on the pad or a failure during launch. Soon, the rocket engines roared to full capacity. They sat rumbling on the launch pad for a few seconds, and their seats pushed hard into their backs. They were going straight up. Gennady reports to the control center that they were all fine and read off data from monitors. After a few violent stages, they were shortly in sudden quietness and weightlessness. The spacecraft was orbiting around the Earth, and they wouldn't feel the weight of gravity again for a very long time. Later on, they were in the engagement stage. Joining two objects in two different orbits traveling at different speeds, the Soyuz and the ISS, is a long process. They have been through this many times, but still it's a delicate maneuver. Gennady scrolled through the checklist on his tablet and started inputting commands to the Soyuz system. They waited until they finally made contact with the space station. Both ISS and the Soyuz were commanded to free drift, rotating freely in space until a more solid connection could be made. Then they went to the orbital module, where the crew usually stays, and got into their blue flight suit. After making sure the seal between the Soyuz and ISS was good, they greeted their new crewmates. Terry Virts, the commander and the only American, Anton Shkaplerov, the only cosmonaut on board the ISS, and Samantha Cristoforetti, an Italian astronaut representing the European Space Agency. Over the course of their year in space, Misha and Scott would see a total of 13 other people come and go. Some would be replaced by new crews. They had a conference call with their families on Baikonur. Afterward, Scott headed down to the US segment with Terry and Samantha, where he'd spend the better part of the year to come. Though ISS is an all-in-one facility, the Russians mostly live and work on their side, and everyone else lives and works on the other side. Terry and Samantha showed him around and reminded him of how things work up there. They also ran through a quick safety briefing in case of emergency. They went back to the Russian segment for a traditional welcoming party. After dinner, they found their crew quarters. For Scott, sleeping while floating wasn't easy, especially being out of practice. After trying unsuccessfully to sleep, a piece of sleeping pill helped him to drift off. For the rest of the fall of 1982, Scott walked around the university campus with a new outlook in life. He had found his life goal. Not only would he become a Navy pilot, he would even become an astronaut. He was ready to get started. The only problem he had was his terrible academic record. He still lacked the skills necessary to learn. He couldn't do what other students could: study. His brother was a freshman at the US Merchant Marine Academy at King Point, New York. Scott felt like it was a good place for him to start too, but due to his bad school records, he wasn't given the opportunity. In his second semester, Scott thought of signing up for more challenging classes. He forced himself to stay in his chair and did homework. When he finished, he felt like he might finally be able to turn things around. Soon enough, the whole process of learning became a little less painful for him. Meanwhile, he applied to transfer to schools. SUNY Maritime, a small military-oriented school in the Bronx, established to train ships officers in the maritime industry, offered him an admission, and he immediately accepted. He made his way in the summer of 1983. It turned out that the military discipline came easy for him. Schoolwork was still hard, but following directions gave him stability. When the school year started, Scott was taking 6 classes. One night, instead of going to a party, he listened to his brother's advice and stayed in all weekend to prepare for an upcoming test. And for the first time in his life, he had earned a perfect score. From that point on, he enjoyed the challenge of school. He knew how to work hard and enjoyed seeing it pay off. The book, The Right Stuff, gave him a vision of who he wanted to be, and his brother's advice showed him how to get there. After his first semester, he was offered a Navy ROTC scholarship. He was pleased to be much closer to his ultimate goal. At the end of the school year, he was already sailing to Europe for his first cruise. He felt like he was finally getting somewhere. He paid attention to his classes on the ship, thinking that a ship's officer would be a good backup career. When they got back home, Scott felt like he stepped off the ship a different person. They were stronger, more resilient, and more competent than when they'd left. After finishing the first cruise, Scott flew to California to do ROTC training on a Navy ship cruising to Hawaii. It was his first real exposure to the Navy, and he was happy to be making progress toward a career in the Navy. His second cruise offered him better work assignments and more authority. Yet, on their first night in port in Spain, they got into trouble. Luckily, their superiors never learned of their mischiefs and adventures, or he would have surely been expelled, costing him the one chance he created for himself. Scott's goal for most of his adult life had been to pilot aircraft and spacecraft, which is why it seemed odd to him that the ISS doesn't need to be piloted at all. But he felt that the ISS was more of a place rather than an object. He had been on the station for a week and was getting better at knowing where he was at. He checked his schedule and the daily summary sent by the Mission Control Center in Houston. He knew it was going to be a challenging day for him, and he was looking forward to it. Their days were scheduled by a program known as Onboard Short-Term Plan Viewer, or OST-PV. There was a dotted red line moving continuously on the OST-PV monitor of his laptop, and each of his tasks had to be accomplished within a time frame. There were times that a time frame would be as short as 5 minutes. The space station is an international effort and a shared facility, but Scott spent most of his time on a bunch of modules, which they just call the lab. Most of the spaces have no windows, no natural light, and no earthly colour. Everything is lifeless, but they have a window that gives them a great view of Earth. Since the Space Shuttle was retired in 2011, NASA has been contracting with private companies such as Space Exploration Technologies, or SpaceX, to develop spacecraft capable of supplying the station with cargo, and even new crews. The uncrewed rockets are the only way for them to get enough supplies from Earth as well as small care packages from their families and new science experiments to be carried out. Soon they were getting ready for the capture of Dragon, a spacecraft that carries their supplies. Scott and his crewmates gathered in the US lab for the daily planning conference with Mission Control and people at other NASA sites all over the world. They went over the day's plans for a few minutes, mostly about the Dragon capture. It's a slow and careful process. Samantha captured it, controlling one of the station's robot arms. Since work still continued during their weekends, they started unpacking the Dragon's cargo on a Saturday morning. Everything in the cargo has a purpose and a specific destination, since it's also easy to lose things in space. After a couple of weeks, Scott began working on the rodent experiment with mice. They needed to study the negative effects of spaceflight on mammals and develop ways to prevent them. Numerous experiments are expected to take place on ISS during the expedition, designed by scientists from different countries and different fields of study. After a successful experiment, Scott went back to his quarters. He floated for a while until he drifted off to sleep. Scott had been appointed to be in charge of supervising drills and training the incoming freshmen. It was a demanding job, but it was his real opportunity to be a leader. He wanted to be the kind of leader who was firm, but fair. In his senior year, he was named the battalion commander of his Navy ROTC unit. He was also taking harder classes. He did whatever he could to improve his chances of becoming a Navy pilot. As he learned more about aviation, his determination to fly difficult aircraft had only grown stronger, despite disasters being reported on television. Seeing the risk involved only made the idea of flying in space more appealing to him. Scott graduated from maritime in 1987. Everything he had learned was life-changing. He was eventually assigned to a flight school in Pensacola, Florida. He went through several weeks of tough physical, swim, and survival training. They also did a great deal of coursework, though it wasn't too different from what he studied in college. After successfully getting through classroom and physical training, Scott finally got the chance to learn to fly airplanes. He studied everything assigned for each day. When he was declared ready, the first phase of his actual flight training began. Together with his instructor, Lieutenant Lex Lauletta, they walked out to the airplane for the first time. Scott was excited and nervous. He had worked so hard to get to that point, but he had no idea if he could actually fly a plane. Lauletta led him through his first pre-flight check. Later on, they were strapped in to start the plane. Once they were cleared for takeoff, Scott ran the power all the way up to maximum and accelerated down the runway, trying his best to keep the airplane pointed in the right direction. When he was settled into the flight, he concentrated on mastering how to maintain altitude. Controlling a training airplane on a first flight was the hardest thing he had ever done. They practiced doing touch-and-go landings, and it was clear that it was going to take him some time to learn. Still, Lauletta thought he had done a pretty good job for his first day. After 12 flights with an instructor, Scott was declared ready to fly a plane solo. It was a big day for him. He climbed into the airplane, but he wasn't feeling confident. He showed his competence with a good takeoff and a flight of about an hour and a half. However, he screwed up with landing. Nevertheless, it was a good early lesson for him. Their next assignments were announced. Scott knew he made every effort and that he worked as hard as he could. A sheet of paper was finally tacked to the bulletin board. He found his name next to the words, Beeville Naval Air Station. Scott had done it, and he was thrilled knowing that his dream was still alive. It was almost 2 months into his mission. Scott and Terry's study with mice ended up in a terrible state where a mouse had lost a limb. They got upset with the situation, knowing that the mice's bodies go through the same changes as theirs in space. They looked sick and disoriented in the first few days, but eventually looked healthier and adapted in zero gravity. Another resupply rocket, a Russian Progress, launched from Baikonur. Unfortunately, a major malfunction occurred and the spacecraft was spinning out of control. Scott and his crewmates were concerned because sometimes the packages contained personal and irreplaceable items. Moments later, the spacecraft was declared lost. However, what concerned them the most was their colleagues, who would be launching soon with the same rocket that just lost Progress. The Russian Space Agency had to make sure that there wouldn't be a recurrence. It was announced the next day in their daily planning conference that Terry, Samantha and Anton would leave by June, more than a month later, since the Progress failed, delaying their return to Earth. The new crew would come up the following month. Scott would be alone for 6 weeks in the US segment before their replacements arrived, though he really didn't mind it. On weekends, they sometimes had other activities scheduled that weren't specifically on the list of priorities. One Saturday, Samantha went to set up and test out a new piece of equipment designed by the European Space Agency, an espresso machine. After working through the procedures, the historic first espresso shot in space was brewed. Meanwhile, one morning, a Progress malfunctioned once again. This challenged their confidence in the Soyuz spacecrafts, which were made with similar components as the Progress, including the one that was meant to be Scott's ride home. They were the subjects of the experiment called fluid shifts, which uses a device to relieve the intracranial pressure of spaceflight. Damage to astronauts' vision was the most troubling negative effect of long-duration missions in space. For some, symptoms were only temporary, but for others, it was permanent. They were hoping to understand more with the study. Before long, it was time for Terry, Samantha and Anton to leave. Terry had already handed over the command of the station to Gennady. A ceremony was seen live on NASA TV on the day they were leaving. The moment they left, everything seemed quiet in the station. The silence seemed strange for Scott. He had no one to talk to in the US segment. On Sunday, Scott had the entire day off. Also, a SpaceX launch was scheduled that day, carrying a lot of things they were looking forward to getting. Unfortunately, while trying to get a clear streaming of the video of the launch, a headline caught his eye, saying that the SpaceX rocket had exploded during the cargo launch to space. In 1988, Scott moved to Beeville, Texas. The town is one of a few centers of the universe for young Navy pilots who want to fly jets. A jet has a lot more power than a propeller-driven airplane. Strapping inside it was more intimidating than he expected. After flying an airplane for about 100 hours, Scott's job was to land the plane on an aircraft carrier, a Navy ship with a flight deck to launch and recover airplanes. The sight of the ship was daunting for him, though his first attempt wasn't bad. He needed to do 6 touch-and-goes, landing and taking off immediately again. He'd have to make 4 actual landings for carrier qualifications. He got through all his touch-and-goes with no problem. He had done well enough on 3 of his landings that he was qualified without the 4th. He soon started flying an attack jet. It was a chance for him to learn more of the capabilities he would need for flying in combat. The pace of the training was aggressive. They were expected to learn quickly. He successfully qualified and got his aircraft assignment. He was to fly the greatest Navy fighter plane ever. After about a year, it was time for the ceremonial pinning, and he got his wings. He then moved to Naval Air Station Oceana in Virginia. He advanced quickly from familiarization training to formation training to basic intercepts, finding another airplane and locking onto it with radar. He also began to learn the basic air combat maneuvers and began feeling like a true fighter pilot. All the training would culminate in taking the airplane to the ship. They did a lot of classroom work at first, and then advanced to learning to fly the airplane in combat. Scott's first arrested landing was a total disaster. He couldn't believe that he failed and had been disqualified. He didn't know how he could improve. Luckily, he was given another chance. He started all over in the carrier qualification phase, and his flying got better. His second attempt was on a dark night, but he managed to land safely and successfully. Over the course of the next year, Scott continued to train and flew to other air stations to practice and continued acquiring new skills. He then applied to US Navy Test Pilot School and was surprised when he got selected. Even better, so was his brother, and they would be classmates. They started in 1993. He didn't find the academic work exhausting. They learned about aircraft performance, flying qualities, flight control systems, and weapons systems of the aircraft. They also spent time familiarizing themselves with the airplanes they would fly regularly during training. They learned to write technical reports, did some experiments, and collected data, and wrote a detailed report on the findings. Scott graduated from pilot school in 1994. Scott was pleased with the quietness and privacy in the US segment, which was a rare luxury up there. Still, he missed having another person to talk to, complain about the challenging work schedule, or talk about what was on the news. He missed being able to get a bit of help with work, although many of the tasks were doable by one person. It seemed like his workdays were longer when he had to do everything alone. The following day was a science sample collection day. He collected urine samples, blood samples, fecal samples, and he would be collecting saliva and skin samples the next day. He would go through the whole process every few weeks for the rest of the year. For Scott, one of the nicest things about living in space was exercise. It's a part of the job, not something they have to fit in before or after work. If they didn't exercise, they'd lose significant amounts of mass. Bone loss is one of the biggest dangers that his year in space would pose to his future health. It's suspected that the bone structure changes permanently after long-term spaceflight. The body is smart about getting rid of what's needed, and the body starts to notice that bones are not needed in zero gravity. While running on the treadmill, Scott received an emergency update that a piece of space junk, an old Russian satellite, was headed their way. It was going to get dangerously close to them, and the impact could depressurize the station, letting their air out and killing them all. The mission control directed Scott to close and check all the hatches in the US segment of the space station. With the hatches closed, if one module was hit, the others might survive. He ran through all the procedures. They then only had 10 minutes before the expected impact. They were making their way towards the Soyuz. Gennady had already prepared this one for flight in case they had to detach from the station. They waited inside until moments passed. They didn't crash with the satellite. They got a signal that it was safe for them to go back to work. Later, As Scott reflected on the situation, he realized that if the satellite had hit them, they probably wouldn't even have known it. It was both comforting and disturbing. The new crew arrived. Their launch was a relief after the recent Progress failures, and docking went off successfully. Scott thought that the new guys would need a lot of help adjusting to the environment, getting settled, and learning to do the work. For experienced astronauts serving on ISS for the first time, the adjustment period is longer, especially for first-time space travelers like Kjell Lindgren and Kimiya Yui. It was already Oleg Kononenko's third time in space. More than 2/3 of space travelers suffer from some degree of space motion sickness at first, and there's nothing else to do but wait it out. Kjell and Kimiya both felt pretty bad on their first day. They needed help in doing even the simplest things. On their second day, Scott offered them his help in learning to navigate in zero gravity. He was teaching them general techniques, which they could use throughout their time in space. Soon enough, Kjell and Kimiya were growing used to the strangely idle life up there, but at least they had some plants. They had begun an experiment in the European module, growing lettuce in a system that used LED lights. They were learning more about the challenges in terms of growing food in space. A few days later, it was time to harvest the lettuce they had been growing. It was the first time American astronauts had eaten a crop grown in space, though the Russians had grown and eaten leafy greens on previous missions. Public reaction was surprising for Scott. People seemed to be fascinated by the idea of growing and eating plants in orbit. It seemed more fascinating than Misha and Gennady, who were outside doing a spacewalk. Since Scott was spending so much time up in space, he noticed that his brain had made a transition to living in zero gravity. He could immediately recognize where he was, and he could find whatever he needed, even when he appeared to be upside down. He thought it may have something to do with the 6 weeks he spent alone, or perhaps it may have been a transition that takes the human brain more than 6 months to complete. If so, he may have found one of the answers that he and Misha were in search of. On the weekend, Gennady, Misha and Scott had to move the Soyuz, which was like reparking a car. When they pushed away from the station and started to fly around, it was strange for Scott to see the station from the outside again. It had been 5 months since he was outside. It felt like a short vacation for them, although he somehow felt more tired than when he left. In early 1995, Scott still had the goal to fill out an astronaut application someday, but he thought he wasn't ready yet. He was a bit on the young and inexperienced side for a pilot astronaut. Also, NASA was looking for a lot of information, such as letters of recommendation, transcripts, and a detailed list of job responsibilities. He thought of taking a minimalist approach with the application, being brief and concise. He would include only what seemed really important, since the deadline was also fast approaching. Fortunately, he was able to submit on time. Months later, his brother Mark got called for an astronaut interview with NASA. He felt happy for him, thinking that his brother deserved it. He was more qualified than he was, having a master's degree in aeronautical engineering. He decided not to mention that he had applied as well. A few months passed and Scott got a phone call from NASA. He was scheduled for an interview. The interview and selection process was strenuous. They were interviewed, took written tests, and went through extensive medical testing. Obviously, astronauts have to be in exceedingly good physical condition and to have as low a risk of developing health problems as possible. Minor issues could disqualify them from flying in space. Soon the time for Scott's interview with the selection board came. He thought about the reason why he wanted to be an astronaut. He thought it was the most challenging and exciting job he could imagine. He wanted to be a role model to inspire future generations. For him, the world needed spaceflight to advance scientific discoveries in medicine, engineering, science, and technology. It would be an honor for him to be a part of any discovery made as a result of the human space program. The official interview lasted around 50 minutes, and Scott felt that he had done well. NASA was to interview 6 groups, and Scott was in the 3rd group. The waiting part was hard for him. As weeks went by, he received a new Navy assignment to join a fighter squadron at a naval air station in Japan. He didn't want to move to Japan until he had heard from NASA. Eventually, he got a call at home and was asked if he was interested to come fly a space shuttle with them. That moment, Scott felt a certain awareness of everything it had taken for him to get there, from reading the right stuff and setting a goal that seemed impossible to that particular moment. His brother was selected as well. It was the first time NASA had selected relatives. Scott's life had just completely changed. He was finally going to have the chance to fly in space. In 1996, Scott spent most of his time getting in good shape. He learned that their class would include international astronauts, which made them the largest astronaut class in NASA history. The first day on the job involved a lot of paperwork and learning the basic aspects of working for NASA. Their training started out in classrooms. Mastering everything was challenging, especially the integration of all the systems together during the mission phases. The complexity of the space shuttle was the reason Scott wanted to fly it, but learning the systems and practicing in the simulators showed him how completely complicated the spacecraft was. They also went on field trips to different NASA centers. They needed to learn about what happens at each of the sites and how all of NASA's projects work together. In between training, they had specific responsibilities within the astronaut office. Scott was trying to learn as much as he could about the space shuttle because it was the vehicle he was preparing to fly. Later on, a senior shuttle commander told him he'd be flying in 6 months for an emergency repair mission to the Hubble Space Telescope, an instrument that has been making observations of the universe since 1990. Scott was the only rookie on the crew and the first American in his class to fly. In July 1999, after a lot of delays, the day finally came for them to launch. The preparation was one of the busiest times for the pilot. Scott was responsible for getting many of the systems ready prior to flight. He needed to be careful and be right on schedule. They were soon being hurtled straight up fast. 2 minutes after leaving the launch pad, they continued to monitor all the systems closely as they travelled higher and faster. Once the shuttle reached its intended orbit, the main engines were cut off. They had survived the launch phase, and they were floating in space. When Scott looked out the window, it was the first time he saw an orbital sunrise. They reached the Hubble Space Telescope on their second full day in space. While in space, Scott had to adjust living in small quarters with 6 other people on an 8-day mission. One thing that surprised Scott about living in space was that it was hard to focus. Doing basic tasks was more challenging in weightlessness. He also felt that his body fluid redistributed itself to his head for the first time, which was odd and uncomfortable. After completing their mission, it was time for them to go home. The landing phase was the most challenging for the commander and the pilot. The space shuttle was a difficult aircraft to land because it had no engines that would allow them to pull up and come in for a second attempt. But they landed safely. Their mission was over. It's a rare occasion for a Soyuz to dock without another one having left recently. The Soyuz that came up was the one that would be Scott's ride back to Earth in 6 months. Their new crewmates were Andreas Mogensen, Andy, Aidin Aimbetov, and Sergei Volkov. Sergei would be there through the end of Scott's mission and would command the Soyuz that he and Misha would go home on. Andy and Aidin were there for only 10 days. Aidin was the third Kazakh to go to space, but the first to fly under his country's flag rather than the Russian flag. After a couple of days, the change of command ceremony was held. Scott was officially the commander of the International Space Station after Gennady. He'd be taking over for the next 6 months. He tried not to dwell on how long he had to go. He was only halfway through. As much as Scott enjoyed having new faces with them, they soon felt the strain of having such a full house. Some of his new crewmates were given permission to sleep on other agencies' modules. A few days later, as part of the twins study comparing his and Mark's immunological responses, Scott gave himself a flu shot, the first one administered in space. They were actually safe from infectious illness, so the shot was intended for the study. They soon gathered to see off the short-duration crew. Scott always found it strange to say goodbye to people leaving in space. They had already formed a strong bond. Gennady prepared the Soyuz, and the crew suited up. Scott hugged each of them, especially Gennady. A couple of hours later, they were gone. 3 days later, Scott hit the halfway point of his mission. In early 2000, the ISS was still in the early stages of construction and wasn't yet habitable. They were building up to train international crews who would work together on the ISS. NASA was looking for a new Director of Operations, or DOR. Scott was offered the job. Although he was reluctant, he accepted it. He was flown to Russia to help him get acclimated. Moving to Russia was a big transition, but he found it easy to settle in. He went home the following year, but he was asked to serve as a backup crew, so he trained back in Russia. He learned their Soyuz and the Russian part of the ISS. He also had to learn the complex US segment of the space station, how to fly the space station's robotic arm, and how to do spacewalks. In the morning of February 2003, Columbia's landing ended up in a tragedy. The shuttle program got suspended until the Accident Investigation Board could come to a conclusion about what had happened. The accident never made Scott think about quitting. Eventually, Scott was named Chief of the Space Station Integration Branch, heading up a group of astronauts and engineers, making decisions about hardware and procedures for the ISS. In 2007, they had a mission to deliver key components to the ISS, which had currently been inhabited non-stop by that time. Training to fly as commander was a completely new challenge for Scott. He had to learn his own role and take responsibility for his crew. This time, he knew what to expect at launch. They reached the orbit safely and successfully. Even though they encountered a problem almost similar to Columbia, they were able to land safely back to Earth. A few months after, Scott got a call from the chief of the astronaut office. He was assigned as a commander of a long-duration flight, which would take place in 2010. He would spend 5 or 6 months on the ISS, which wasn't exactly what he was hoping for. In November 2007, Scott underwent surgery due to an early detection of possible prostate cancer. The surgery was to minimize the risks to his career. Recovery took a long time. In spite of that, he was aggressive in getting his NASA qualifications back. With the help of NASA flight surgeons, he returned to near normal in due time, and he was able to start flying again in January. In early 2008, he started training for his mission to the space station, and he would be launching with 2 Russians, Sasha Kaleri and Oleg Skripochka. He already had a lot of experience working with the Russians in Star City, and that would lighten his training load. He also spent 4 weeks training in Germany, with instructors coming from countries throughout Europe. Then he travelled to Tsukuba City to train with the Japanese space agency. Scott and Kjell were about to have their first spacewalk. Spacewalks are a practical necessity for exploration or to perform maintenance, repairs, or assembly on the exterior of the spacecraft. They felt prepared and confident in the equipment and the people who were keeping them safe. They did a series of checks on their spacesuits to make sure they were not leaking. Kjell accidentally switched something on ahead of time on his suit. They were aware that there was a very good chance NASA would not allow them to continue. Suit experts on the ground discussed whether to proceed and what precautions they would need to take. In his spacesuit, he felt like he was in a tiny spacecraft rather than wearing something. The US spacesuits include simple propulsive jets they could use to maneuver themselves in space in case their tether breaks off and they screw up. Once they had everything they needed, the first thing they did outside was to look over each other's suits from head to toe to make sure everything was in order. Scott was guided by the mission control on a step-by-step procedure to check Kjell's portable life support system. It looked completely normal, so their spacewalk proceeded. They were ready to get to work. They moved to their respective work sites. Scott's first task was to remove insulation from a main bus switching unit, which is a giant circuit breaker that distributes power from the solar arrays to the downstream equipment. Meanwhile, Kjell's task was to put a thermal blanket on the alpha-magnetic spectrometer, a particle physics experiment that has been sending back the kind of data that could alter the understanding of the universe. It needed to be protected from the sun if it was going to continue doing its job. From time to time, Scott had to be aware of his tethers, whether they were properly attached. He needed to focus on the task at hand, to complete it properly, and be aware of the overall timeline for the spacewalk. His next task was to work on the hand of the robot arm. Without it, they couldn't capture and bring in the visiting vehicles that delivered food and other necessities to the US side of the station. Kjell was working with cables, routing them to enable future visiting vehicles to dock. However, their tasks were taking much longer than had been scheduled. They called it a day, even if they could last another few hours, since they had to leave enough time to deal with any unexpected problems. The toughest part of the spacewalk was maneuvering themselves back into the station. Once he was out of his spacesuit, Scott felt that just being in the suit was more draining than the full day of tiring work. That evening, they went down to the Russian segment for a little celebration. Scott thought that on days like that, it was clear that the crew could truly pull together as a team, and that was one of the rewards of the hardest day he had ever had. The Russians have a very different system for medically certifying people to fly. Since Russian surgical procedures and treatment options for prostate cancer are not as advanced as those in the United States, their statistics on survival and recovery are very different. But Scott's flight surgeon worked hard to convince the Russian doctors that he would be fine, and NASA stood by him as well. In the end, the Russians agreed to let him fly. He began training for his mission to the space station in late 2007. By that time, Scott was intimately familiar with the way the Russian space agency handled training. Some of their training took place at other sites, as they learned to do everything, from repairing the equipment on the space station to conducting experiments across many scientific disciplines. They travelled to Baikonur for their launch. When they reached orbit and the space station, Scott was elated to be starting a long-duration mission. He was on board with 2 Americans, Doug Wheelock and Shannon Walker, and 1 Russian, Fyodor Yurchikhin. On the mission, Scott learned the differences between visiting space and living in space. On a long-duration flight, he worked at a different pace, got more comfortable moving around, slept, and ate better. A few weeks later, the new crew arrived. Katie Coleman, an American astronaut, Paolo Nespoli, an Italian astronaut, and Dima, the Soyuz commander who had been a backup crew with Scott. They replaced Shannon, Doug, and Fyodor, who had already departed for Earth. By that time, Scott had already taken over as commander of ISS for the first time. Discovery, the orbiter Scott had flown on his first flight, came up and docked with the station on its last flight. Scott floated over to visit it and felt a wave of nostalgia. Shortly after Discovery and its crew returned to Earth, it would have its engines removed and sent to the Smithsonian's National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. to become a permanent display. Discovery had left Earth more times than any spacecraft in history. Sasha, Oleg, and Scott were scheduled to return to Earth on March 2011. Their landing was violently jarred due to blizzard conditions at the landing site at Kazakhstan. Soon after, the space shuttle was retired. In 2012, NASA learned that the Russians were going to send a cosmonaut to the space station for a year. NASA announced a year-long mission themselves. Once the Year in Space mission had been announced, they still had to choose the astronaut to do it. Many astronauts expressed interest. The requirements to be considered were many. In the end, only 2 people qualified, and Scott was one of them. A few weeks later, he learned that he would be flying in space for a year. The year-long mission was announced in November 2012, with him and Misha as the crew. The idea of leaving the Earth for a year didn't feel especially vivid for Scott until a couple of months before he was to go. Again, he and Kjell had spent days preparing their suits and equipment, reviewing procedures, and conferencing with experts on the ground for their second spacewalk. They had 2 goals. One was to replumb a cooling system, bringing it back to its original configuration, and the other was to top off that cooling system's ammonia supply, which was to cool electronics, since the station was getting roasted by the unfiltered sun while its solar arrays generated electricity. Their worksite was so far that they needed to use the length of both their safety tethers together to reach it. They worked with their tasks together, and then worked on different tasks separately. Upon reaching the point where they had to get back inside, Scott needed to go back to his site to fix a problem because specialists were seeing data they weren't happy with. His body was already aching, but he obliged. He reached the worksite, and as soon as he was done with the job, they were instructed to head back inside. Scott and Kjell shared a look, realizing they had shared this experience that they both knew was at the limit of their abilities and could have killed them. By December, a Cygnus resupply launched successfully. In addition to the regular supplies of food, clothes, oxygen, and other consumables, it also carried experiments and supplies to support research in several fields of study. A few days later, they said goodbye to Kjell, Kimia, and Oleg. Scott still had 3 months ahead of him. On December 15th, Yuri Malenchenko, the Soyuz commander, Tim Kopra, and Tim Peake launched from Baikonur, but there was something wrong with the approach of their spacecraft. They had a failure in the automatic docking system. Yuri took over manual control. After a few minutes, he was able to guide the craft successfully for docking. The next day, Scott heard during the daily planning conference that they had a problem. The mobile transporter was stuck, making dockings impossible for future visiting vehicles. A Progress would be docking the following week. Scott thought it might have been his fault. He must have inadvertently locked the brakes during their second spacewalk. This meant that he'd have to do an emergency spacewalk. It's much harder to prepare for a spacewalk in short notice, especially with colleagues who were still adjusting to this strange environment. On Monday, Scott prepared for his third spacewalk with Tim Copra. It would be shorter than the previous ones. It felt strange for Scott to have accomplished their main objective in only 45 minutes. They finished up some tasks that he and Kjell had left undone. After 3 hours, they came back inside. It was Scott's third Christmas Eve in space. The last 2 weeks of work had been very demanding, coming one right after the other. He had worked nearly 2 weeks without a day off, so his mood going on Christmas was a little less festive. It was just another work day on the schedule. That day, they were fixing the exercise device, since exercise is nearly as important to their well-being as food and oxygen. Before dinner, Scott called his partner Amiko, and he felt that something was bothering her. Amiko explained that the holidays were tough for her. Scott understood how she was carrying such a heavy burden with everything, since he was not there to help her out. All the pressures had been taking a toll on her. At times, she felt like she was just Scott's co-worker rather than a partner. They needed to reconnect when he got back. The satellite dropped, and Scott lost her in mid-sentence, but he had full confidence in their relationship. Later on, Scott let the reality of the situation to sink in. His partner wanted something very simple, which was human touch, and he couldn't give it to her. Scott made his way to the Russian segment. The Russians don't celebrate Christmas the same time as they do, but they were all happy celebrating the holidays together. When he got on the phone with her again, Amiko told him that it seemed that he didn't miss her or need her, because he made the effort to make a year in space look easy. Scott explained that making it look easy was the only way he could convince himself to do it, but it wasn't easy at all. Scott figured out that him missing her was obscured by how much he really missed everything on Earth, and that made her feel more alone in the situation. As they got towards the end of the long-duration mission, their trainers started to slowly ramp up their resistance exercise to adjust their bodies to the stresses of being back in gravity. But while exercising, Scott had torn a muscle in his hamstring. His flight surgeon prescribed him a muscle relaxant. That afternoon, Scott felt calmer and more content with his surroundings. His flight surgeon mentioned that the drug was sometimes prescribed for mood and anxiety disorders. Scott thought that being up there had been getting to him. He had to set aside stress so he could concentrate on what he needed to do. He tried to enjoy the positive side effects of the drug while it lasted. January 2016 was a great day on the ISS for Scott. He was thrilled to see Tim Peake become the first British astronaut to do a spacewalk. A few days later, Scott took a great picture of the city of Houston and the Gulf Coast on a beautiful night pass. He sent the picture to Amiko. To his surprise, he found that he was starting to allow himself to look forward to getting back. Later in January, they saw through the second major botanical project on board the station. They were growing flowering plants, zinnias. They expected it to be more difficult because the plants were more delicate, but the lag in communications made it harder for Scott to take care of it properly, following instructions from the ground. He decided to take over the whole process. It became a personal project for him, and it was important that they did it well. Also, later that month, Scott led a moment of silence for the crew of the Space Shuttle Challenger, which was lost 30 years ago that day. 30 years ago, a lifetime ago, he couldn't have imagined where he was at that moment. He remembered his college roommate asking him whether he still wanted to go to space, and he wanted to go more than ever. One Sunday morning, while having breakfast, aside from it being Scott's birthday, Misha pointed out that they had only 9 days left. Scott, Sergei, and Misha would do a few Soyuz training sessions together so they would be ready for their descent. They started packing up their things and getting organized to leave. He decided what he would bring back with him on Soyuz. He sent Amiko a list of things he wanted to have when he got back. From time to time, he was aware of missing all sorts of random things. He also thought about what he would miss in space when he got back on Earth. It felt strange to him that he was about to leave space. In February 2016, he handed over the command of ISS to Tim Kopra. The following day, they would leave the station and return to Earth. They were gathered in the Russian segment, having a photo op of them floating in front of the Soyuz. When it was time, they each hugged Tim K, Tim P, and Yuri and said their goodbyes. Just before Sergei closed the hatch behind them, Misha turned to touch the wall of the space station one last time. The process of coming back down from space was even more violent and uncomfortable. Descending from the Soyuz capsule was one of the most dangerous moments of the year, and one of the most physically grueling, since the Earth's atmosphere is naturally resistant to objects entering from space. The three of them had to survive a fall through the atmosphere. Scott put on his Sokol suit and remembered the day he wore it for launch. Everything that happened before seemed distant to him now. Then, one by one, they floated into the Soyuz. Soon after, they were nudged away from the station. Inside the Soyuz, Scott suddenly felt exhausted from the whole experience. The return to Earth took about 3.5 hours. With many steps, they got through successfully. Soon, they felt gravity beginning to return. Everything was oddly heavy. They were falling at the speed of sound. They fell and waited and watched. Moments later, sunlight streamed in the window as they watched the ground come closer and closer. And then they were down. They had landed. They waited for a few minutes, then the rescue crew extracted them from the capsule. They took in the smell of air and the landscape all around them. They were taken to nearby camp chairs for examination by doctors and nurses. His flight surgeon, Steve, was there. Scott knew his family was at the mission control in Houston watching the live feed. Scott thought that sometimes people want to hear about a scientific discovery or insight, but he doesn't have anything like that to offer. In terms of data they've collected, scientists are excited about what they are seeing so far. Results and scientific papers will continue to emerge over the years and decades based on the numerous experiments they conducted over the year. Scott also learned about more practical issues of how to conduct a long-range exploration mission. This is what crew members on ISS are always doing. They're studying how to make things better for the future. The larger struggles of his mission will have a larger impact on future missions on the space station and future space vehicles. Since 1999, Scott has been assigned to spaceflight or training practically non-stop. It will be an adjustment for him to no longer plan his life this way, and he took the chance to reflect on the things he had learned. He learned to be really calm in bad situations. He learned to focus on things he can control and ignore what he can't. He learned that giant leaps all start from small steps. He learned that it is important to sit together and eat together with other people because he yearned it while in space. He learned what it meant to be together with his family again. He doesn't know everything, so he learned to seek advice and counsel and to listen to experts. He learned that an achievement is accomplished by probably hundreds or thousands of people behind it. He learned a new kind of empathy for everyone else. He learned to appreciate even the little things on Earth, and that Earth is the most beautiful thing he's ever seen. Scott will always be a part of several examinations as he continues to live his life. Since science is a steady process, it may take years before discoveries or breakthroughs are achieved based on the data. For him, nothing compares to having been a part of progress in terms of human knowledge. He has been travelling around the world, sharing to others the things he experienced in space. He was pleased that people were curious about his mission, and they think, similar to him, that travelling to Mars can be possible. In the summer, Scott's father died, but he was certain he lived to witness his mission become a success and to celebrate his return. Scott was happy that they had a much improved relationship toward the end of his life. There are moments where Scott is reminded of his time in space. On his computer, there are countless images of the ISS. A year is made up of millions of those photos. But one image that doesn't exist is the view outside the Soyuz window as Sergei, Misha, and him departed the ISS, and that image will always remain with him. He knew he would never have the chance to see it once more, the place where he had lived for more than 500 days. In this uncertain and compromised world, the ISS is the success of engineering and collaboration. For Scott, it serves as a validation that once we truly focus on working hard on something together, anything is possible. The end.